Hello, I'm Bob Jessup from Lancaster University, and I'm recording a lecture on capitalism, financialization, and the decline of democracy. The outline of the lecture is that I deal with capital as a social relation. I'll address the Pashukanis question. I'll then consider the comprehensive contradiction of state power based on Marx's work, contrast rational versus political capitalism based on the work of Max Weber, deal with the relationship between finance and liberty, and discuss the finance-dominated accumulation and neoliberalism. I'll discuss authoritarian statism, and then I'll introduce the idea of the austerity state, and then I'll reach my conclusions. We begin with the idea of capital as a social relation. Marx asks in Volume 1 of Das Kapital, in the very first chapter, why does wealth in societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production take the form of a mass of commodities? And his answer is that the commodity form is the self-form of the capital relation and the basis of bourgeois societies and social order. The capitalist mode of production involves profit-oriented, market-mediated accumulation linked to the rational organization of capitalist production and trade in free markets. In other words, money is accumulated, invested in commodities and the production of commodities, which are then sold for a larger sum of money than the sum of money originally invested. MCM prime. Marx also argues in Das Kapital that the growing integration of the world market generalizes and intensifies contradictions. As the world market becomes more integrated, contradictions become harder to escape, displace, or defer, and the possibility of world market crises emerges. However, rational capitalism isn't the only game in the world economy. We now turn to the Pashukanis question. This was a question posed by the Soviet legal theorist Eugene Pashukanis in Stalin's Russia, writing about the nature of law and Marxism and asking a specific question about the capitalist type of state. This question was, why does the dominance of a class take the form of official state domination? Or, which is the same thing, why is not the mechanism of state constraint created as the private mechanism of the dominant class? Why is it dissociated from the dominant class, taking the form of an impersonal mechanism of public authority isolated from society? In posing this question, Pashukanis is asking why the capitalist type of state is not characterized as by pre-capitalist modes of production by the exclusive monopoly of the dominant class. In other words, in the capitalist type of state, there is a dissociation of state power from the exclusive political authority of the dominant class. A preliminary answer to this question draws on Marx's analysis in Volume 1 of Capital, where exploitation takes the form of exchange, dictatorship may take the form of democracy. As Marx explains in Capital Volume 1, capitalism extends the commodity form to labor power, which is seen in the nature of the capital-wage-labor relation. Surplus labor can be appropriated as surplus value. Exploitation can take the form of exchange. Marx also argues in Capital that the form of political organization corresponds to the form of economic organization. So dictatorship may have a democratic form where economic and political classes are separated, subject to the logics of market forces and liberal democracy, respectively. Whether or not this form of possibility is realized depends on the balance of forces. We'll now turn to another answer to this question. We will now expand the preliminary answer to Pashukanis' question. And this is as follows. Where the market economy and the state are organized separately, but in complementary ways, we will find that economic class struggle will normally take place within the logic of the market. That is to say, capital and labor will struggle over wages, hours, working conditions, and prices, and in turn, political struggle will normally obey the logic of a constitutional representative state. That is to say, it will take place over how one defines the national interest, attempting to reconcile the specific interests of citizens and property owners within an illusory general interest. In these terms, class is absent as an explicit organizing principle of the capitalist type of state. The dominant class has no legal monopoly of political power. It must compete for power on equal terms with members of the subaltern classes. And this explains Pashukanis' question. In other words, in liberal bourgeois democracy, which was the focus of Pashukanis' book on law and Marxism, the bourgeois democratic republic is the formally adequate type of capitalist state. But one should also note that not all capitalist states are democratic. Once democracy emerges, reversals can occur, and specific policies may not be substantively adequate to capital accumulation, to the overall reproduction of capitalist relations of production, or to the continuation of bourgeois rule. Marx himself notes the contradiction in capitalist democracies between the majority political power of the dominated classes and the minority economic power of the dominant classes. It can be reconciled only if both sides accept the democratic rules of the game, and in so doing reproduce the conditions of class domination. Marx himself pointed this contradiction out in his work on class struggles in France, published in 1850, where he refers to the democratic constitution and says that the classes whose social slavery the democratic constitution is to perpetuate, the proletariat, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, it puts in possession of political power through universal suffrage. From the class whose old social power it sanctions, the bourgeoisie, it withdraws the political guarantees of this power. It forces the political rule of the bourgeoisie into democratic conditions, which at every moment help the hostile classes to victory and jeopardize the very foundations of bourgeois society. From the first group, it demands they should not go forward from political to social emancipation. From the others, they should not go back from social to political restoration. In other words, we can say about political capitalism and democracy that arguments about the formal adequacy of liberal bourgeois political democracy for capitalist social formations assume that capitalist exploitation takes the form of exchange. However, with the rise of neoliberalism and finance-dominated accumulation, exploitation also depends on three kinds of political capitalism as defined by Max Weber, but also studied in other work on capitalism, included by Marx and his followers. That is to say, political capitalism takes the form of exploitation through force and domination, through predatory forms of appropriation, and unusual deals with political authority. And we can say then that where exploitation doesn't depend on exchange, but takes the form of force and domination, predatory forms of appropriation, or unusual deals with political authority, the conditions for liberal bourgeois democracy are undermined. Combined with intensifying crises on a world scale, this further weakens the conditions for liberal bourgeois democracy. We now turn to Max Weber's analysis of modes of capitalism, based on three main modes of capital accumulation. The first is rational capitalism. The second type is political capitalism. The third type is traditional commercial capitalism. Beginning with rational capitalism, which is based upon the rational organization of capital accumulation to maximize profits, we find the first mode is trade in free markets and the rational organization of capitalist production, which Marx analyzes in all 3 volumes of Das Kapital. The second kind of rational capitalism is capitalist speculation and finance, where capitalist finance calculates opportunities for profit on the market and seeks to maximize its returns. Turning to political capitalism, based not on exploitation taking the form of exchange, but on the use of political power or political authority to maximize profits or to seek profits where possible, we can distinguish predatory political profits, profits on the market from force and domination, and profit from unusual deals with political authority. And we can illustrate predatory political profits from tax farming, profits on the market from force and domination with the examples of building colonies, seizing territory, and building empires. And we can illustrate profit from unusual deals with political authority from the examples of crony capitalism, where profit makers seek to form unusual deals with political authority by dealing with crony capitalist plots of one kind or another. And finally, we have traditional commercial capitalism, which takes the form of traditional types of trade or money deals, for example, changing money in temples, as Jesus criticized in the Bible. Let me describe, first of all, the descriptive aspects of financialization. In this, we see the proliferation and expansion of financial markets, the deregulation of the financial system and the broader economy. We see the development of new financial instruments and institutions. We see the dominance of finance over profit-producing capital, affecting investment and production. Market forces, complemented or reinforced by policies, underpin rising inequalities in income and wealth. Consumption tends to be sustained by extending credit to the working class. Finance colonizes economic and social reproduction. And we see the development of a special economic culture based on accounting, managerialism, and debt culture. Those were the descriptive aspects of financialization, and I now turn to the analytical aspects. In terms of the analytical aspects of financialization, which we can describe as finance-led growth, the basic principle of financialization is the transformation of future streams of profit, dividend, or interest income into tradable assets like stocks or bonds. This is also known as securitization. We see the development of pattern of accumulation in which profit making occurs increasingly through financial channels rather than through the rational organization of trade and commodity production. This is based on the work of Greta Krippner. We see the increased importance of fictitious credit, fictitious capital, and fictitious profits in economic dynamics, with fictitious credit, fictitious capital, and fictitious profits not corresponding to developments within the real economy. And we see this regime of finance-led growth reflecting the systemic weight and power of financial markets, financial motives, and financial institutions and elites in the national and international economy. We can see a telling illustration of the implications of finance-led growth and rational capitalism and liberal democracy in the following quotation attributed to the Honorary Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. He wrote, "We must make our choice. We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." And although this is an aphorism attributed to Brandeis, you can see what else he wrote in his book, Other People's Money and How Bankers Use It, published in 1914. And this is an illustration of give a man a gun and he can rob a bank, and give a man a bank and he can rob the world. And I think this is an interesting illustration of the implications of financialization and finance-led growth for political capitalism. Turning now from financialization to neoliberalism and political capitalism, I want to argue that neoliberal system transformation, for example, what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, neoliberal regime shifts, for example, the rise of Reaganism and Thatcherism, and their principled commitment to shifts of regime, neoliberal structural adjustment conditionalities imposed by political capitalism through force and domination on third world countries, and even pragmatic neoliberal policy adjustments found, for example, in Scandinavia, are not the result of spontaneous free market forces. In other words, they're not the result of rational capitalism. The first three forms of neoliberalism, system transformation, regime shifts, and structural adjustment, result from unusual deals with political authorities seeking profits from force and domination, for example, what David Harvey calls primitive accumulation through dispossession and political predation. And we can see in this sense that neoliberalism is the result of political capitalism rather than rational capitalism. And if we sustain neoliberalism, especially in crisis periods, it encourages the dismantling of liberal democracy. This table presents an analysis of how neoliberalism privileges the value aspects of the capital relation, bearing in mind that Marx analyzes two contradictory aspects of the commodity in Das Kapital, its exchange value aspects and its use value aspects. In relationship to the commodity, for example, neoliberalism privileges the exchange value, the profits that derive from commodity exchange, over the use value aspects that derive from production. This can be seen in relationship to labor power, where labor power is not valued in terms of the concrete skills that specific laborers bring to production, but in terms of the socially necessary abstract labor that's embodied in human labor power in capitalist production. This means, in turn, that the wage is considered as a cost of production rather than as a source of demand. In relationship to money, money is valued as interest-bearing capital and as international currency that can be exchanged on international markets, as opposed to a measure of value and national money that is controlled by national banks and the national state. In relationship to productive capital, that is to say industrial capital, neoliberalism treats industrial capital or productive capital as abstract value in motion that is free to move around the world, as opposed to a stock of assets that need to be valorized in specific times and places. We can regard the state for neoliberalism as the ideal collective capitalist, as opposed to a factor of social cohesion in class-divided societies. Knowledge, in turn, is considered as a source of intellectual property based on intellectual property rights, as opposed to intellectual commons that is created for general use, as in the general intellect analyzed in Marx's Grundrisse, and nature we can see as a source of absolute and differential rent, rather than as the inheritance of spaceship Earth. Now I'm arguing here that neoliberalism privileges the value aspects of the capital relation, and this might seem contradictory to the argument that neoliberalism is a form of political capitalism. What I'm trying to do here is to show how neoliberalism privileges the value aspects rather than its rational capitalist aspects. So neoliberalism, if you like, privileges the rational aspects of capital accumulation in terms one-sidedly of privileging the value aspects as opposed to the material aspects of the capital relation. And the implications of that is neoliberalism is exploitative also of the material aspects of the capital relation. We can see this in relationship to the distinction between wage-led and finance-dominated growth. Wage-led growth, for example, in the Keynesian welfare national state, prioritizes the wage as a source of demand, labor power as a set of concrete skills, productive capital as a stock of assets to be valorized in a given place and time, money as a medium of exchange, and money as national or state money to be controlled for maintaining the level of demand and levels of full employment. Finance-dominated growth or finance-led growth prioritizes the wage as a cost of production, labor power as abstract labor, trying to control unit labor costs, productive capital as profit-seeking new investment sites around the world, money as interest-bearing capital, and the circulation of money as international currency. And one of the implications of the privileging of neoliberalism and finance-led growth is the rise of authoritarian statism, as described by the well-known Marxist state theorist Nikos Poulantzas, who was born in 1936 and died in 1979. And he referred to authoritarian statism as intensified state control over every sphere of socio-economic life, combined with a radical decline of the institutions of political democracy, and with draconian and multifold curtailment of so-called formal liberties. He expanded this in terms of specific features of authoritarian statism as follows. He referred to the transfer of power from the legislature to the executive and the concentration of power within the latter. He referred to the accelerated fusion of the three branches of the state legislature, executive, and judiciary, with a decline in the rule of law. He referred to the functional decline of political parties as the leading channels for popular political dialogue with the state and as major forces in organizing hegemony. And he discussed the rise of parallel power networks that cross-cut the formal organization of the state, with a major share in shaping its activities outside formally accountable mechanisms. And we see this particularly in the global scale, with the development of bodies like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and so forth, as coordinating political power across the state and with relationship to crony capitalist forms of organization, shaping the activities as outside formally accountable mechanisms. And one of the implications of the rise of authoritarian statism and neoliberalism and finance-led growth is the development of austerity, which can be described as punishing the poor for the mistakes of the rich. And we can describe some of the features of austerity states in the following terms. Firstly, there is a shift in the economy from wage-led growth to finance domination, a redistribution of income from wage earners to capital, the promotion of precarity in all areas of life as a disciplinary tool to reinforce the financialization of everyday life, the recomposition of the social and demographic profile of the population with a growing inequality in wealth and more stratification within classes. It facilitates the penetration or capture of the state by corporations. It speeds up the turn from the welfare state with its shared citizenship rights to a coercive workfare form of organization, and especially in the United States of America, by the increasing resort to penality of the incorporation of citizens into the penal system. And it promotes the values of hierarchy and competitiveness. As I say, these are features of the austerity states which are developed unevenly across different states in different national and regional economies within the European Union and so forth. I reach now my conclusions. Firstly, we should not fetishize the institutional separation between economy and politics, market and state. We should see this institutional separation as essential features of the capital relation on a societal level. We should see economy and politics, market and state, in other words, as forms of organization of the domination of capital. In this sense, state power is an integral part of the reproduction of the capital relation, but is not reducible to its role in this area. The state is involved in far more than reproducing the capital relation, as we see, for example, in the development of the welfare state. We should conclude that accumulation depends on the strategic use of economic and extra-economic resources for differential accumulation, which shows itself in Weber's analysis of the relationship between rational capitalism, political capitalism, and traditional commercial capitalism. In other words, extra economic resources are important for economic accumulation as well. State intervention is never absent from the process of capital accumulation, whether in conditions of stability or conditions of crisis. And the state is active not only in general and particular material policies, but also in organizing capitalist power blocks and disorganizing subordinate classes and forces. And the final set of conclusions is that financialization is a key moment of neoliberalization. Financialization gains from and drives the forms of neoliberalism. It gains from and drives liberalization, deregulation, privatization, administrative recommodification, in other words, the promotion of market proxies in the residual state sector. It promotes internationalization, and it promotes a shift to indirect taxes so that all consumers, all economic subjects have more freedom to decide how they invest their income in this or that resource. Neoliberalization and financialization are mechanisms of the formal and real subsumption of formerly extra economic relations under the logic of profit-oriented accumulation. The real economy, in other words, is subordinated to the profitability of capital as property, and this occurs through profit-oriented accumulation based on political capitalism. In other words, neoliberalism and financialization involve political forms of capitalism, they undermine the separation of economics and politics and thereby contribute to the decline of liberal bourgeois democracy. And that brings me to the end of this lecture.